cultural milieu. And I'm going to suggest to you that they've been effective at promoting achievement and that they're universal principles which don't depend on religion. And just to be clear, what we're going to speak about tonight has nothing to do with heredity. It has nothing to do with IQ. It has nothing to do with suggesting that anyone is better than anybody else. This is purely about a set of values that anyone can be exposed to and anyone can learn. And I'm going to try to suggest to you tonight that those principles have some enduring value for education and for achievement. So to start out, I want to span the period that we're going to broadly speak about, which lasts about a millennium, begins in Europe, although of course references the origins of the Jewish intellectual tradition in the Torah, in Israel, and in Babylonia. And I want to highlight two individuals who sort of bookend this period. One, a Jew who grew up in Muslim Spain in the 11th century, and the other, Robert Aumann, professor at Hebrew University in Israel in the 21st century. And what I want to suggest is that the creativity in their work, which is truly astounding, was derived from an ancient religious tradition that some people might suggest is rigid and would inhibit creativity, but in fact actually promotes it in a variety of ways. So this picture is a picture of the Alhambra Palace. As you'll see in a moment, that was actually built in the 14th century, a couple of hundred years after Shmuel HaNagid. But there at least are some historical sources that suggest his son actually designed the Alhambra Palace. Just to give you a sense of the importance of the palace, this is a brief video clip.
If there is one place which challenges the stereotype of the treacherous, bloodthirsty Moor, it's here, the Alhambra Palace in Granada. The Alhambra is one of the most complete medieval Islamic palaces in the whole world. It was built by the Muslim kings of Granada in the 14th century at the height of their power. Its name means the red one because the dark surrounding soil has given its stones an earthy reddish hue. The marvel of the Alhambra is its mystery. Not a single account of life here survives. All its archives were incinerated in the fires of the Inquisition. But the Catholics couldn't bring themselves to destroy this place. The Alhambra is one of the wonders of the medieval world. And by preserving it, they've kept a box of secrets that we can use to decode the civilization that built it.
So, Shmuel HaNagid had an absolutely astounding career. He was a poet, a politician, and a leader, as well as a great Jewish writer. How did he get started? How could a Jew, a second-class citizen in Muslim Spain, at that time, Muslim Spain was divided up into 6 different kingdoms. One, perhaps the most powerful one, was the Kingdom of Granada, where he lived and was born. Samuel HaNagid was a shopkeeper who happened to do some business with people in the palace. And so he came to the caliph's attention. And from there was initially appointed as a writer and scribe in the palace because, like the Jews of his time, was literate in several languages, including Arabic. Subsequently became a military leader, and for 17 years, including some very famous victories, commanded all the armies of Granada. He also was a tremendous Jewish scholar and wrote several books with the specific intention of showing that the nexus of Jewish intellectual achievement had shifted from Babylonia to Europe. Now, there were others who were involved in that, in particular Italy, but in Spain, he was the one who was really responsible for saying we can produce first-class scholarship and legal decisions in Spain. We don't have to depend on the Babylonian academies, which were losing their influence due to persecution. So I mentioned that he was a poet, and this is an example of one of his poems. He adopted a style where he was able to merge Jewish liturgy, which had been the history of Jewish poetry up till then, with generic Arabic writing. And this is an example of one of his poems, and I won't read the whole thing. The horses lunged back and forth like vipers, darting out of their nests. The hurled spears were bolts of lightning, filling the air with light. Arrows pelted us like raindrops, as if our shields were sieves. This is a poem, of course, that he wrote during one of the battles that he commanded. When he returned home to what was thought to be one of the great libraries of Granada, and libraries are a theme that we talk about quite a bit in the book, he worked on Jewish literature. But part of the tragedy of Jews of Spain is recognized through his life, and as I mentioned, his son, who some say designed the Alhambra Palace that you saw, is that his son actually, 20 years after his death, was too successful for some of the Muslim population of Granada. He was killed in a pogrom where many other Jews also perished. So he represents both the height of intellectual achievement, artistic achievement, as well as the tragedy of Jews in exile, particularly in Spain. But if you can imagine someone today who was a military leader, a world-class writer, a religious leader, and the assistant in a prejudiced society to the ruler, you can imagine how talented he must have been. We fast forward a millennium to Robert Aumann, and this is a scene from the movie about John Nash, A Beautiful Mind. Russell Crowe, playing his character, explains a little bit about game theory.
Adam Smith said, the best result comes from everyone in the group doing what's best for himself, right? That's what he said, right? Incomplete. Okay? Because the best result would come from everyone in the group doing what's best for himself and the group.
So I know that was hard to hear, but this was sort of a simple articulation of the idea of game theory, that the best results for everyone involved don't happen when you worry just about yourself. The best results happen when you engage in behavior where everybody succeeds. Now, Robert Aumann, who won the Nobel Prize, actually expanded that theory. And he expanded the economic theory to a case which is very common, both in economics and in society in general, when you have repeated interactions with the same group of people. How do you behave when it's not just a one-off, but when you have repeated interactions? And he expanded the philosophy, theory, and equations of game theory to that economic situation, which is, of course, very common. But he wrote a very interesting article. He wrote an article showing how about 1,500 years before game theory was invented, the Talmud actually, without calling it game theory, dealt with a game theory problem. And the game theory problem in the Talmud appears in the Mishnah and is the following case. A person passes away and he owes 3 people money. One 100 dinars, one 200 dinars, and one 300 dinars. And his estate doesn't have enough money to cover all the debts. He might have 100, he might have 200, he might have 300. And the question is, how do we fairly divide those claims? And Aumann, in this article, which we won't have time to go into tonight, argues that the Talmud solution is essentially a game theory solution designed not to maximize the rights of any single individual, but to maximize the rights of everyone there. So I mentioned to you that we sort of suggest that the origin of the Jewish intellectual tradition is biblical. And in trying to think about this problem, I decided to sort of think about, what does the Torah tell us about intelligence? And the general word, of course, in Hebrew for intelligence is chachma. And the question that I asked was, where does that word appear in the Chumash? How often does it appear, and who is it referring to? And it turns out, and I apologize here, I have to try to navigate back for a second. It turns out that more than half of the references to intelligence in the Chumash refer to one individual, Bezalel, the architect of the tabernacle or Mishkan. And why is that significant? Well, for a couple of reasons. One is, it's clear that the Torah has a very broad view of intelligence, because there was architecture, there was art, there was weaving, there were a lot of different crafts in addition to science and geometry that Bezalel had to know. But the second thing is, the Torah actually tells us a little bit about what distinguished Bezalel. And this is from Parshat Ki Tisa in Shmos, and says the following: Va'amaleo so ruach Elokim b'chachma u'b'sfuna u'v'das u'v'chol melacha. And I've given him chachma, tevuna, and das, those three things. And then a couple of chapters later, ulahoros nasan b'libo, I've taught him to teach as well. So I want to focus on those four different characterizations of Bezalel's intelligence: chachma, bina, da'as, and teaching. So Rashi tries to define what this is. Chachma, or wisdom, is the acquisition of knowledge. Bina, Rashi says, is being able to be creative with knowledge that you have. And das, which is the one of those three traits which is defined differently by different commentators, Rashi says is divine inspiration. The Rambam's son pretty much agrees with Rashi about Chachma and Tevuna, those two. But Das, he suggests, is an integrative form of knowledge. Not necessarily divine inspiration, but an integrative form of knowledge. Others suggest that Das is actually the physical action or the creative ability that results from the first two, meaning you've actually built something. And that's a definition that I want to try to focus on in the next couple of minutes, that Das is creative intelligence with an end purpose. So the last of the four principles, lahoros nasan b'libo, that the Torah says that Bezalel was a teacher because, of course, it was a large group that was required to build the tabernacle. And Bezalel not only had to have the ability to build it himself, but had to have the ability to teach others. And many commentators, thinking about intelligence, focus on the analogy between Bezalel, the architect of the Mishkan, who the Torah says was given the ability to teach, and Shlomo HaMelech, considered the wisest man who ever lived, who also had the ability to teach. And basically what the commentators say is, there are some people who are absolutely brilliant, but they don't have the ability to teach others. And the ability to teach is a separate, specific skill. So, expanding on those four principles that refer to Bezalel, I want to suggest to you that there are four general principles that are involved in the Jewish intellectual tradition. One is the respect for precedent, but encouraging creativity. A second is intellectual knowledge for the pursuit of truth. A third is the primacy of education. And the fourth is the idea that knowledge is meant to have, as a result, a productive life. And so each of these principles, chachma and bina, which is respect for precedent but encouraging creativity, das, which is truth, lahoros, to teach, and finally a productive life, which is an alternate definition of das, that these four principles, in some way derived from the commentator's view of Bezalel's intelligence, have sort of, in some way, integrated themselves in Jewish tradition, in what's passed on to future generations, and encourage creativity. There isn't time to talk about all of these tonight, and so I thought tonight I'd just spend a few minutes talking about my view of one of these principles, which is the primacy of education. And of course, the obligation for Torah study and for education comes from the Chumash, from Shema, V'shinamtem levanecha v'dibarta bam. You shall teach your children and speak to them, and you do it at your home, on the road, in the morning and night. And that inheritance, morashaki las Yaakov, it's an inheritance which we're required to pass on to others. So the obligation for Torah study and for universal literacy, which historically has characterized Jews, appears initially, and its origin is in biblical commandments. The Rambam talks about the fact that every Israelite is under an obligation to study Torah, poor or rich, sound health or ailing, young or old, even if you're poor. And when do you have to study? Until the day of death. So here, education is a value that's not just for children, but adult education, as I guess we're doing tonight, is a value that lasts forever. There are medieval sources about Jewish literacy, that literacy was present in Jewish education, that traders were also learned people, and that the spillover from this universal education helped Jews in the Middle Ages in crafts, in trade, in money lending, and in medicine, because there's some data to suggest that in medieval Spain, 30% of the physicians were Jewish, and that the same was true in Italy and in other places in Europe. So the obligation to study, the presence of universal literacy, is an integral part of one aspect of the Jewish intellectual tradition, the teaching aspect that characterized Bezalel. There's also a unique aspect to Jewish teaching, which is chavrusa learning, or the one-on-one collaboration or group learning that was present and described in the Talmud and continues to be an aspect of yeshiva education till today. And as you're aware, in many yeshivas, the rabbi lectures for only an hour and a half during the day, and peer learning and group interaction occupies many hours of the day. And there are actually several different stories in the Talmud about chavrusa learning. And so there's a very colorful character about a story that relates to chavrusa, or peer-to-peer learning. Choni Hamago. He's called Choni Hamago because in another story in the Talmud, he drew a circle and challenged God in a sense. And much to his colleagues' consternation, succeeded. But this story about Choni is the following. All the days of the life of Choni, he was distressed of the idea, Shir HaMalos, B'shuv Hashem es Shivas Tzion hayunu kechomim. This is after the Jewish people returned to rebuild the temple. It was like we were dreaming. And he says, is it possible that a person can sleep and dream for 70 years? How is it possible to compare the 70-year-old exile in Babylonia to a dream? So he was walking in the road and saw a man planting a carob tree. And Choni said to him, "After how many years will it bear fruit?" And the man said, "It will take 70 years." And Choni said to him, "You won't be around in 70 years. You're an old man." And he said to him, "The world I found is full of carob trees, and I'm planting for the future." Choni sat and ate bread, and he slept. And he slept for 70 years. And he saw a man gathering carobs, and he said to him, "Are you the one who planted this tree?" And he said, "I'm his grandson. And I now am reaping the benefits that happened when the man planted the tree 70 years ago." So there's a lot of cooperative thinking in this story, but the end of the story is the point I wanted to make. And Choni then, after 70 years, returned and tried to go into the study hall and claim that I'm Choni. And they didn't believe him and didn't pay him respect. And there was no one for him to learn with. And he said, "O chavrusa o misasa," either friendship or collaborative learning, or I'm going to die. And then Choni passed away. So it's a strange Rip Van Winkle story, but it shows how the fact that he lost his study partners in the study hall was an integral part of his existence. And he couldn't exist, despite all his greatness, without those study partners and without the intellectual and practical friendship that came from cooperative learning. And although not shown here, there are a number of current scientific studies about the power of collaborative learning. And in many college and graduate school courses now, collaborative learning projects are an integral part of education. And of course, in many high-tech companies, there's not a formal, rigid hierarchical structure, but rather a group of 3, 5, 7, or 8 people are put together on a project and expected to function collaboratively to get that project done. And while collaborative learning and collaborative projects are relatively new in American education, in American society, they go back 1,500 years in the Talmud. So I talked a little bit about how one of the other unique aspects of education in the Jewish tradition is that education is not just for children. And this is just an example of several medieval communities who talked about the fact that we need not just to teach children, but adults have to spend time studying. And if you look at the last one here, that the community has to establish a study hall, studies must be carried on 2 hours before midnight, 2 hours after midnight. And the origin of the kollel here is from the Ashkenazic Jews of Jerusalem. But you can see from these references going back hundreds of years, building on the Talmudic tradition, the idea of universal study into adulthood continues to be a part of that tradition. Another part of the educational tradition is the idea of the value of books. And this is a quote, again, a medieval quote: "Make books your companions, let your cases and shelves be your pleasure grounds and gardens, bask in their paradise," etc. Rav Hai Gaon, writing over 1,000 years ago, said, "At all times, let your book be on your person, and your intelligence will always cling to you. Keep it attached to you, and it will prove your source of healing." Of course, books have changed. We've gone from parchment to a codex to printing to digital material. But the idea of valuing and venerating the study of books and books themselves is one that persists and forms a major part of the Jewish intellectual tradition. Respect for scholars and teachers is another defining aspect of the Jewish intellectual tradition. Of course, that respect not only translates to a respect for Torah and God, but it translates to a respect for the learning of scholars. Another famous story from the Talmud, Hillel, as an impoverished young man, wanted to study in one of the academies. He didn't have enough money because I guess there was an entry fee to those academies. And so he climbed to the roof of the building and listened through the skylight and was found in the morning covered in snow. And they admitted him to the academy because they recognized that his love of learning superseded whatever membership dues they needed to maintain the study hall. So I'm going to now switch gears on this idea of love of learning and education to Lev Vygotsky, who had mature psychological theories about children's cognitive development, something he called the zone of proximal development. And he's considered one of the leading lights of modern educational theory, writing over 100 years ago, talked about what people now talk about the first 100 days, how important they are for child's education. It's his theories of proper education that really spawned current educational theory. And Lev was highly influenced by the Jewish tradition in his early education. So I just spent a few minutes talking about one of those aspects, the aspect of teaching. But taking all four principles together, which is the primacy of education, the love of truth, respect for precedent, but encouraging creativity, and using intellectual achievement for a purposeful life, I want to suggest 11 specific recommendations from the Jewish intellectual tradition that are universal in nature. That is, they don't depend on belief in God, they don't depend on Jewish religious practice, but they help spawn achievement. And as you'll see, some of the examples that I'm going to provide to you are not Torah examples at all. So the first is respect for precedent and critical thinking, which is don't fear innovative ideas, but ground creativity in a mastery of prior research. And despite the fact that there's a very rigid hierarchy of ideas in Jewish thought, the Tanaim, the Amoraim, the Gaonim, Rishonim, and Achronim, these are 5 periods. And I would argue also the post-Achronic period beginning in 1945. There are periods where we venerate the idea that we can't really contradict earlier authorities in some ways, or at least some scholars believe that that's the case. But every Jewish learning experience is based on the idea of Kiddush, of creativity. So no matter what respect we show for precedent, we also value creativity. So how does this differ from Western thought or the Supreme Court's respect for precedent? I would suggest that the idea which you may have heard discussed recently at the Supreme Court hearings of super precedent is what sort of defines the Jewish intellectual tradition. But despite that respect for super precedent, intellectual creativity is highly valued and venerated. So I mentioned not all my examples are going to be Torah examples. This is Bob Dylan, an interesting kind of Jew, but nonetheless someone who was raised in the Jewish intellectual tradition in the Northern Midwest. He received the 2016 Nobel Prize for Literature for having created new poetic expressions within the great American song tradition. And this small characterization of Dylan's achievement really defines this idea of respect for precedent, but encouraging creativity. Bob Dylan hosted a radio show on cable radio for about a decade, where he talked about the origins of the great American song tradition going back to the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And it's very clear that his work didn't arise de novo, but resulted from an exhaustive study of the American music tradition, which he expanded in a very creative way. A second principle is this idea of logical reasoning in the pursuit of truth. And here I will use a Talmudic example. The Gemara in Pesachim relates the story about an argument about the origin of day and night. And it doesn't seem that they got it exactly right based on modern scientific thinking, but there are some ideas that you'll see are familiar. And it's an argument between the sages of Israel and the sages of the nations of the world. And it's an argument about how day and night are created. And apparently at that point, everyone sort of believed that there was this rakia, as the Torah refers to it, that was opaque. And the sages of the nation said that the sun during the day is below the firmament, and at night rotates behind the earth, and therefore we don't see any sun. The Jewish sages said that it rotates around the rakia. And of course, you'll recognize that to some extent, you could extrapolate to modern astronomy from the idea of the sages of the nations. So who is right in this argument? So Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, the author of the Mishnah, the compiler of the Mishnah, said that the sages' opinion appears to be more accurate. His reasoning perhaps is not easily understandable, but he says that the sages of the nations are more accurate. And in writing about this, Rav Avram ben Rambam, the son of the Rambam, says, "Ube'emes nikra Adon Zer Rabbeinu HaKadosh." This man, Rabbi Yehuda, is called holy. Ki Adam kishiyashlech me'al panav hasheker v'yekayim ha'emes v'yachri'enu lamito v'yachzor bo midaito kishpar lo ein safek hu kadosh. That the holiness is to recognize that you're willing to admit you were wrong. In this case, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi is willing to admit that Jewish sages were wrong and pursue the truth, that is indeed the definition of holiness. We talked a little bit about education, the primacy of education. Surround yourself and your family with the written word, treat it with affection, and consult it in whatever medium it is presented. Ahad Ha'am, the Israeli writer, said that even if books just lie in the corner without anyone paying attention to them, they still have a spiritual effect just by being in the house, for the simple reason they represent the physical and visible form, the fact that sometime, somewhere, a man's thoughts and ideas were concretized in print. So education is important, but so is a love of books. Seek out noted scholars, authoritative works, and great ideas as your constant companions. I alluded to this earlier. Rav Soloveitchik, the leading thinker of modern orthodoxy in the 20th century, talks about when he gives a shiur, he sees his grandfather, he sees earlier authorities, and his job when he teaches is to introduce these people to his pupils and to make them feel present in the room. And by respecting those authorities and by making students feel like they're in the room with them, he transmitted the Jewish intellectual tradition in a way that few others ever have. Train with a master mentor to be treated with proper reverence. These days, you can find a lot of information on the internet, but we believe that based on the Jewish intellectual tradition, that training with someone whom you respect, who has the wisdom of ages, can make a huge difference in accomplishment. So we're going to have another general example here, showing how this tradition made its way into modern music. Arno Schoenberg was one of the most creative composers around, even though, to be fair, he's not my favorite composer. But in eulogizing his mentor, Mahler, he said the following: instead of using many words, I will simply say, I believe that Mahler was one of the greatest men and artists. I remember distinctly the first time I heard Mahler's Second Symphony, I was seized with an excitement which expressed itself physically in the violent throbbing of my heart. I was overwhelmed. He was capable of the greatest possible achievement of an artist, self-expression. The genius lights the way, and we strive to follow. Our passion for the object of our veneration must inflame us, that everyone who comes near us must burn and be consumed by the same ardor and worship, the same fire which is also sacred to us. That's how Schoenberg viewed one of his mentors, Gustav Mahler. And that's the idea of finding a mentor who can excite you to reach greater heights, who can excite you to intellectual achievement. In the book, we say something along the lines of worshiping reality TV hosts and talk show hosts won't get you there. Finally, I talked a lot about a study partner eager to debate ideas in text. And I mentioned already that there's a lot of modern research and literature to show that that improves intellectual achievement. And finally, the highest possible standards of education for children. I'm not going to read this, but in 1983, there was a report by the National Commission on Excellence in Education suggesting that our standards for educating our children have diminished and that our schools are failing our children. And of course, almost 30 years later, if you look at the results of schooling, you'll see that we haven't gotten much better. But the focus on education of children, particularly early on, is crucial and important. And the biblical commandments to do that have made their way in the Jewish intellectual tradition. Place a premium on continuing education. One example of continuing education is the Daf Yomi. This is the 2020 Daf Yomi celebration. Just sort of as COVID was beginning to rear, and you can see the MetLife Stadium full. Finally, a couple of things of the last principle, the idea that education leads to a purposeful life. Leon Modena, do not be distracted from your determination to advance and accomplish despite impediments, major or minor, that stand in your way. A colorful figure Leon Modena was in 16th century Italy, had an amazing library. Leon Modena was a gambling addict. He could not stay out of the casino. And his life in many ways was destroyed by his gambling addiction. But nonetheless, he was a tremendous writer, and he understood that whatever was going on, don't be distracted. This is the date, a brief history of the Rambam, one of the great philosophers and thinkers in the Western world, and of course, someone who have produced amazing works of scholarship, the first unified code of Jewish law, the Moreh Nevuchim, a philosophical work, Guide to the Perplexed, as well as letters for everyone else. What's important to realize about the Rambam is that it's not as if he had a life, a sedentary life, where he could focus on intellectual achievement despite distractions. He's born in Cordova, Spain. His family flees Cordova during a pogrom and wanders for 11 years. Through all of this, finally settling in Fez and then in Egypt, he writes letters about conversion. He writes a commentary on the Mishnah. He moves to Alexandria. His father passes away. He begins the Mishnah Torah. His brother dies in a shipwreck and he has to take over his business. He becomes the chief rabbi of Cairo, finishes the Mishnah Torah, raises children, writes the Guide to the Perplexed. And through all this is the physician to the Sultan and spends his days healing the Sultan and his family in the palace, then coming home, taking care of the Jewish community in Fastad, and answering questions. And with all this distraction, fleeing pogroms, being forced to support his family with no help from others, the Rambam produces what's perhaps the greatest creative collection of Jewish scholarship in all of history. by one individual. It's a testament to the fact that if you believe that intellectual achievement in life has a higher purpose, no matter what challenges you face, you can accomplish amazing things. Live daily life with a sense of purpose, that the values you transmit can ennoble yourself. And I'll close with this and leave some time for questions. Albert Einstein wrote, "Is the essence of that Jewish conception of life seems to me to lie in an affirmative attitude to the life of all creation. The life of an individual only has meaning insofar as it aids in making the life of every living thing nobler and more beautiful. Life is sacred. It is the supreme value to which all the other values subordinate. The individual life brings in its train a reverence for everything spiritual, a particularly characteristic feature of the Jewish tradition." And Einstein, of course, was raised in the Jewish tradition, although some would probably characterize him as an atheist. But he recognized these values, these universal values transmitted as part of the Jewish intellectual tradition that get us to where we are today in 2020. And part of the reason that we spent some time writing this down and studying it is that we think these principles don't depend on being Jewish. They don't depend on IQ. They don't depend on a belief in God, but they're principles for leading a creative, purposeful, and noble life that can be applied to anyone and that can be learned by anyone. So thanks for your attention. I'll be happy to answer any questions that you have.
Okay, if you'd like to either unmute yourself or raise your hand to be heard, if you have some questions, please share them with us.
So there's one question in the chat that I can address, which is, someone has suggested that the Talmudic study tradition was always equated with critical thinking, but now much of the yeshivish community has an anti-science and conspiracy theory idea. What does that tell us about the future of the Jewish intellectual tradition? So it's an excellent question. And look, the critical thinking skills and the need to produce something of lasting value that characterize the intellectual tradition can be interpreted by different people in different ways. And there's no question that up till the 17th century, the Jewish intellectual tradition was a little monolithic. And since then, it has separated into different kind of streams. And so there may be areas of the tradition where people don't fully realize the creativity and pursuit of truth ideas that are fully, I believe, part of it. And there are other parts of the Jewish intellectual tradition where people don't necessarily even recognize that some of what they're doing is Jewish. So it's become complicated, but I believe that observation of what's going on today in Jewish learning, in secular learning, and in Jewish achievement suggests while the tradition has become more diffuse and more complicated, and maybe even more difficult to define, its future is probably pretty bright. There is some hesitation there, and some of the hesitation addressed in that question is a hesitation that we look at in the book when we try to predict what will happen in the future. But we think that something this vibrant that's lasted well over a millennium will survive some of the vicissitudes of what's going on today.
Thank you. Anyone else? So how do you think this all fits into, or is this the same idea when, as a focus on kind of a Das Torah approach to Jewish life amongst the more and more of the observant population? What impact is that having on the originators of the Jewish intellectual tradition?
So that's a great question. I think that first I'll give you my own view of the Das Torah idea. The Das Torah idea that the sage or scholar who should, in my view, be venerated, has universal knowledge about everything and ought to be consulted about everything. The one point I want to make is that it's what we would call a Kiddush. It's a new invention. The Rav Soloveitchik used to say, who was educated in the yeshivas of Europe, used to say, I never heard of such a thing in Europe. It never existed. It's a recent invention. And it's an invention that incorporates some of the tradition in a major way, which is this respect for scholars and respect for Torah scholarship. But what I think it does is it denigrates the creativity that for many years has been present in everybody. And so I think that it's, in my response to the other question, it's one stream of the Jewish intellectual tradition which has become more diffuse. But it's one that I think doesn't incorporate all the aspects of the Jewish intellectual tradition that I think are important. Because the idea that creativity should be encouraged, questioning should be encouraged, and that we ought to respect knowledge wherever it comes from, as Rav Avram ben Arambam said, that represents true holiness. I think that's lost a little bit in some of the manifestations of Das Torah. It is important and it's one aspect, but I don't think it incorporates everything.
Thank you.
Do you credit this tradition with perhaps the success of the Jewish community wherever we've gone to rise up in the ranks? Meaning you look at the community that's moved here post-Holocaust and a few generations later, and you look at what we've been able to achieve. Do you think that this part of our tradition about the importance we place on education is the explanation for that?
So I think the answer is yes, but it's not just education. It's the idea that I expressed perhaps obliquely, that we're here for a purpose, and that purpose is to be productive. And what I would say in amplifying that is, whether you believe that because you believe that's why God put us here, or whether you believe that perhaps that's an aspect of a human being's destiny and requirement. The idea that you're here for a purpose means that you're going to persist in achievement, even in the worst of circumstances. And if you look historically at the times when society has produced great intellectual achievements, even though sometimes the individuals who've done that have been poor, it's always been in a society where success has been manifest. The great artwork of the Renaissance, great scientific achievements in the 20th and 21st century, they're coming from societies that are highly successful. And what's unique about the Jewish intellectual tradition is that we've been able to accomplish those things despite adversity. And so I think you're absolutely right, and I agree with you completely, that that's one of the things we think results from the Jewish intellectual tradition. But it's not about being Jewish. It's about having the idea that we're here for a purpose.
For sure.
Education is important. And so that's why we suggest that this is...
it's exportable.
It's exportable. So there's a question from one of the listeners here on the chat, addressing the importance of pursuing truth given the rise of alternative facts. So I think fungible truth is one of the great dangers of modern society. And I think both factual and moral relativism is a huge danger. And it's one that I think hasn't elevated us, but rather has created challenges for us. And I think that the final piece of the question is, what do we do when we live in an age of post-truth? Well, I don't think we're quite there. I don't think we're truly in an age of post-truth. I think we're in an age where those of us who value truth have to continue to fight for it. And I think ultimately, my belief is we'll win, although reading the paper on some days, you may not get that attitude. But I really do believe that we're not fully in an age of post-truth, and it's our responsibility as inheritors of a tradition where truth is valued, regardless of its consequence. We have to continue to fight for truth. And I'm confident that we'll be able to win. but it's not going to be easy, not in today's society.
Can I ask, first of all, I really appreciate the words you just said. But as it is not a function of being Jewish, are there other sets of peoples, communities that have had similar results as the Jewish people in terms of the set of values affecting achievement, et cetera?
So it's a great question. I would say that none of these values are purely unique. It's the constellation that sort of brings them together. One of the interesting things, you can find some of these values, for example, in Confucian theory. And China for a time, as my wife, who's a sinologist, will tell you, was by far the most advanced civilization in the world. And there were tremendous scientific, cultural achievements in China. And I'm not an historian, and some might dispute this, but I think that when China closed itself off to the creativity of the rest of the world is when that began to change. The Great Fleet was withdrawn, the Great Fleet of China, which explored the entire world. Somehow there was a fear that culture would be polluted. They backed off engagement with the outside world, started no longer valuing creativity and truth in the same way they did before. And that's when the achievement sort of backed off. So I think there are analogies elsewhere. But I think if you look at intellectual achievement, and not just intellectual achievement, but societal achievement, I think you can find pieces of this in many places. But I think we're losing a little bit of this in American society today. And that's part of the reason I think it's important to reemphasize this set of values. Because on the one hand, you can say, well, doesn't American society value all these things? Well, as was pointed out, there's a little bit of a post-truth world out there. There's a little bit of a denigration of mentorship, a belief that past knowledge isn't so important. I talk a little bit about science. I'm a research scientist in one of my former careers, as well as a cardiologist. I talk a little bit about science. There are some journals these days that say you can't quote a paper more than X years old. And some of the great scientific achievements even recently have been people who've gone back and looked at prior studies, reinterpreted them in the light of modern scientific knowledge, and made tremendous advances. So I think the lack of appreciation of some of these principles, revering mentors, looking carefully at past knowledge, encouraging continuing education and truth, I think we're backsliding a little bit. And that's part of the reason we wrote this book, to try to sort of emphasize that these values remain important. They're not all purely Jewish, but I think the constellation has a Jewish flavor. And some of the quotes from non-religious thinkers that I talked about, I think, help demonstrate that. And I don't want to, sort of be in a triumphalism stage, but when you look at the 2020 Nobel Prize winners, it's hard not to imagine that there is something unique here in terms of this tradition.
Okay, once again, Dr. Kadish, I want to thank you so much for making the time available. Again, I want to thank our dear friend Rabbi Siner for helping to coordinate this evening's opportunity for us to learn and expand our knowledge about our knowledge. And I want to wish everyone a Shabbat Shalom, and thank you for joining with us.
And thank you so much for inviting me. I appreciate it, and look forward, as I said, to seeing you at some point in the future.
Amen. Thank you. We look forward as well.
Take care.
Thank you so much. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
You.
Laila Tov, everyone.